Zethu is strapped to an operating table right now, and the man holding the scalpel is the same man who once told her he loved her. If that sentence didn't stop you in your tracks, let me say it again slower. Shobane, the man Zethu almost married, is about to operate on her against her will, and by the end of today's episode you will not know whether to scream at your screen or cry into your popcorn. Stay with me, because this is the episode Homecoming fans have been building toward for 2 weeks, and it does not disappoint. Before we get into the blow-by-blow of episode 38, The Harvest, let's rewind just enough to understand how we even got here, because the storyline has been simmering since the start of the month and it has finally boiled over. A couple of weeks ago, we watched Shobane make the worst decision of his life. He sealed a deal with Shobane, a partnership built on nothing but power and profit, and from that moment on, we knew Shobane was stepping fully into his villain era. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't a slow slide. It was a man choosing money over morals with his eyes wide open, and Homecoming has made sure we watched every second of that choice so that nothing that happens today feels cheap or unearned. What makes this so painful to watch is that Shobane isn't a cartoon villain. He's not twirling a mustache. He is a doctor, a man who trained for years to save lives, and now he's the front man for an illegal organ harvesting operation run out of what's supposed to be a legitimate clinic. Shobane is the one pulling the strings, but Shobane is the one holding the instruments, and that contradiction is exactly why this character has become must-watch television. Early on we saw Shobane realize that his new role had already come back to bite him. The money was flowing, sure, but so was the fear. Every phone call made him flinch. Every knock at the door made him check over his shoulder. And by midweek, his operation with Shobane had already started to unravel, cracks were showing, and Shobane knew it. Meanwhile, on the other side of this story, we have the woman who refuses to let it go, Zethu. If you've watched the show from the beginning, you know Zethu doesn't leave it alone. She trained to be a surgeon. She has spent this entire season fighting to prove herself in a system that keeps telling her no, and now that she's stumbled onto something rotten, there was never a version of this story where she just walks away. Everyone around her, her family, the people who love her, begged her to leave the investigation to the police. She didn't listen. She dug deeper into the organ harvesting operation despite every single warning, and that determination is what put the target on her back in the first place. And then came the gut punch. While Zethu was out there chasing the truth, Vusi was rushed to Bergville Hospital on the verge of death. That scene alone had viewers reaching for tissues, because Vusi's storyline this season has been a slow-motion car crash, a young man spiraling under the weight of a drug problem that everyone around him could see except, it seemed, himself. Watching him fight for his life in a hospital bed while Zethu is out there fighting a completely different battle gave the show one of its most emotionally loaded weeks in months. It also forced a reckoning. When Vusi finally understood the real consequences of his addiction, it wasn't a lecture from a parent or a friend that got through to him, it was nearly losing his own life. That's the kind of storytelling beat Homecoming does well. It doesn't preach, it just lets the consequences land. By Friday of last week, the two storylines that had been running on parallel tracks, Zethu's investigation and Shobane's descent, finally collided. Zethu found out who was behind the organ harvesting. Let that sink in for a second, because this is the moment the whole season has been circling. She finally had a name, finally had proof pointing toward the truth, and in typical Zethu fashion, she realized far too late that she had bitten off way more than she could chew. This is a woman used to being the smartest person in the room, used to solving problems through sheer will and intelligence, and for the first time this season, we watched the fear actually register on her face. She wasn't dealing with hospital politics or family drama anymore. She was dealing with people who make bodies disappear. That fear turned out to be justified almost immediately. Monday's episode, No Way Out, pushed Shobane to the edge in a way we hadn't seen before. The woman he once loved had become the literal price he had to pay for his own freedom. Shwabi made it painfully clear, Zethu wasn't just collateral damage anymore, she was the collateral. Shobane's freedom, his safety, maybe even his life, were now tied directly to what he was willing to do to the one person he used to protect above everyone else. And the episode ended on that gut-wrenching question that had everyone talking online for the next 24 hours, will Zethu make it out alive? Which brings us to today. Episode 38. The Harvest. And I have to say, even knowing this was coming, watching it unfold was still a gut punch. The episode opens with Zethu already held captive. This isn't a slow build where we watch her get taken, we're dropped straight into the aftermath, straight into the fear. Held by the man she once loved, she's forced into a corner where every choice in front of her is a bad one. This isn't Shobane sweeping in as a rescuer. This is Shobane standing over her as the very person who's supposed to operate on her, and every ounce of history between them, the almost wedding, the years of friendship, the moments where he genuinely seemed like the better man for her, gets weaponized in this scene. It's uncomfortable to watch precisely because it should be. We spent a whole season being told Shobane loved her, and now we're watching what that love is actually worth when money and fear get involved. What makes this episode so effective isn't shock value, it's the slow, deliberate way it strips away any excuse we might have made for Shobane. There's no moment where he's secretly planning to save her. There's no wink to the camera telling us it's all a ruse. What we get instead is a man who has convinced himself that this is simply what has to happen, that there's no other way out, and that conviction is somehow scarier than outright cruelty would have been. Zethu, for her part, isn't given the luxury of a dramatic escape plan either. She's forced to make a terrible decision in order to save her own life, and the show is smart enough not to make that decision easy or heroic. It's messy. It's desperate. It's the kind of choice that will have consequences stretching into the next several weeks of the story, and you can feel the writers setting up fallout that isn't going to resolve neatly. While all of this is happening in the clinic, the show cuts to a storyline that's been quietly building in the background and finally gets its moment to matter, Norwich. He spent this season trying to change his life, often without much support from the people around him, and today he makes a move that reshapes the entire search for Zethu. He enlists Kobo's help to find his sister, and on paper that sounds like a simple, sensible decision. Of course you'd want more hands looking for someone you love. But the show plants a warning right there in the same breath, this decision might hinder his investigation. Kobo isn't a neutral party here. Her own marriage, her own entanglements, her own complicated loyalties mean that bringing her into this search doesn't just add resources, it adds risk. There's a real possibility that pulling her in gets information back to exactly the people Norwich doesn't want to know that he's closing in. That tension between Norwich and Kobo has been one of the more quietly compelling threads of the last few months. These are two people who've been drawn to each other in ways neither of them fully wants to admit, and now they're being forced into a partnership that has nothing to do with romance and everything to do with survival. Watching them try to navigate that, the unspoken feeling sitting right next to the urgency of a missing woman, adds a layer of complexity that keeps this episode from being a one-note thriller. It's not just will Zethu survive, it's who ends up compromised trying to save her. There's also a quieter, sadder thread running underneath all of this, and it's the one involving the people who love Zethu but don't yet know how deep this danger really goes. Her family is still operating with only fragments of information. They know she's missing. They know something is wrong. They don't know she's on an operating table right now. That gap between what the audience knows and what the characters on screen know is where a lot of the tension in this episode lives. We're watching people make decisions, who to trust, who to call, how hard to push, without the one piece of information that would change everything. It's classic Homecoming, using dramatic irony to keep us leaning forward even when the pacing slows down for a scene that isn't directly about Zethu. By the midpoint of the episode, the show does something clever with its editing. It starts intercutting between the clinic and the search efforts happening outside it, and the rhythm of those cuts speeds up as the episode heads toward its climax. Every time we cut back to Zethu, more time seems to have passed, more preparation seems to have been made, and the sense of a ticking clock becomes almost unbearable. Every time we cut to Norage and Maunkobo, we get a little closer to a lead, a little closer to a location, but never quite close enough. That structure is doing a lot of work to build suspense without relying on cheap jump scares or manufactured chaos, and it's a good reminder of why this show has built such a loyal following this season. I also want to talk about the performances here, because this episode asks a lot of its two central actors and they deliver. The actress playing Zethu has to sell absolute terror without ever losing the character's core intelligence. Zethu isn't reduced to a screaming victim, she's still calculating, still looking for an opening, even while she's genuinely afraid, and that balance is hard to pull off. And the actor playing Shobane has maybe the hardest job in the episode. He has to make us believe that this man, who we watched fall in love, who we watched try to build a life, has arrived at a place where he can stand over her with a scalpel and still tell himself he's not a monster. That's not an easy needle to thread, but the performance makes the horror of the scene feel earned rather than melodramatic. As the episode moves toward its final act, the show pulls back slightly from the clinic and gives us a beat with Shobane, who remains the true architect of everything happening today. Shobane doesn't get his hands dirty directly, he doesn't need to. He's built a structure where Shobane does the cutting and takes the risk while Shobane collects the profit and keeps his own hands clean. That dynamic has been one of the more chilling elements of this entire arc, because it mirrors something painfully real: exploitation dressed up as opportunity, someone convincing a desperate or compromised person to do the dangerous work while staying comfortably out of reach themselves. Watching Shobane calmly manage the fallout of Shobane's unraveling operation, without a flicker of guilt, tells you everything you need to know about who the real threat in this storyline actually is. The episode closes without fully resolving the question it opened with: will Zethu make it out alive? And that's exactly the right choice. This is a telenovela built on cliffhangers, and The Harvest earns its ending by refusing to give us an easy answer. What we're left with instead is a tangle of consequences: Shobane, further trapped by a decision he can take back. Norage and Maunkobo, now bound together by a search that could expose both of them in different ways. Vusi, still recovering from his own brush with death, unaware of how close another person he cares about has come to the same fate. And Zethu, somewhere in that clinic, having made a choice we don't yet fully understand the cost of. If there's one thing this run of episodes has proven, it's that Homecoming isn't afraid to let its characters make genuinely bad decisions and then sit in the consequences of those decisions for weeks at a time. Shobane's fall from a man Zethu once trusted with her future to a man complicit in an organ harvesting operation didn't happen in one episode. It was built, deliberately, choice by choice, and today's episode is the payoff of that slow burn. That's good writing. That's a show that trusts its audience to remember what came before and to feel the weight of it when it finally arrives. So where does this leave us heading into the next episode? All eyes are going to be on whether Norage and Maunkobo's search actually gets somewhere, or whether that risk the show flagged, the possibility that involving her hinders more than it helps, comes back to haunt them. All eyes are going to be on Shobane, and whether there's any path back for him after this, or whether the show has fully committed to him as this season's tragic villain. And of course, all eyes are going to be on Zethu, and just how far the fallout from whatever decision she made in that clinic is going to spread through the rest of her family. That's where I'm going to leave it for today. If you've been following this Shobane and Zethu storyline as closely as I have, drop your predictions in the comments. Do you think Zethu gets out on her own, or does someone find her just in time? And do you think there's any redemption left for Shobane, or has he crossed a line the show isn't going to let him walk back from? Let me know what you think. Hit subscribe if you want the next recap the moment it drops, and I will see you for the next episode.